Hello everyone and welcome to the second day of Habitat for Humanity International's Europe Housing Forum. And after yesterday's cracking day of debate, I'm very much looking forward to it. We had some wonderful speakers yesterday and some fantastic sessions exploring how COVID-19 had exposed the weaknesses of decent, affordable housing provision prior to the pandemic and highlighted our common vulnerabilities and need as a society for everyone to have a safe home. We discussed the limitations of city governments in meeting the challenge and how local authorities need greater collaboration and access to capital to rise to the challenge. And we heard some inspiring stories of hope too from Africa and India, where authorities and residents of informal settlements had worked together to upgrade and build new homes, roads, sanitation and clean water infrastructure. The best responses were based on political leadership and a recognition of people's citizen rights to basic services. So today has a hard act to follow, but looking at the programme, I'd say we're on a roll. Today, we'll be looking at the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations and the challenge of finding sustainable and affordable housing solutions that can withstand unpredictable and devastating weather events. We'll be exploring how public and private sectors can collaborate to discover innovative new finance models for affordable housing, and we'll be taking a look at the different approaches and common housing challenges throughout Europe. But before we get to our first plenary session, can I just remind you that today is also day 2 of our parallel residential energy efficiency for low-income households event, and you can find its sessions by clicking on all events on the left-hand column in the deal room lobby. So our first plenary today is the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations and the role of housing. Our moderator for the discussion is Habitat for Humanity International's James Schell. James is a senior manager for the Middle East and North Africa and focuses on shelter and settlements, urban programming and resilience. James.
Thanks so much, Dean. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are, to you all, and welcome to the session. So as Dean mentioned, with this session specifically, we'll be taking a global focus, so not just focusing in the sort of European context, but globally, unpacking the issue of the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, and specifically looking at the role of housing in this. So, as Dean mentioned, hello, my name is James Schell. I'm a Habitat for Humanity Senior Manager for the Middle East and North Africa region. So over the 90 minutes, and with thanks to our panelists whom I'll introduce to you in a few seconds, yeah, I'm looking forward to unpacking this issue and really having a conversation. We don't have slides or presentations. This is a conversation, and really encourage all of you just to pop questions into the chat boxes as they come to you. And the intent is we'll get to those towards the latter half of the session. So for this next 90 minutes, just some of the questions and topics we'll be unpacking is looking at existing measures for adapting to climate change that take into consideration cities and the urban poor, and also looking at the reality of increasing rates of displacement. We'll be looking at that. We'll be unpacking and discussing how can we provide more comprehensive and multi-scale disaster risk reduction, DRR, and climate change adaptation, CCA, you'll hear these acronyms a lot, initiatives. And towards the latter part of the session, we'll start to unpack the intersection between the need to increase access to housing, coupled with the reality of the high carbon footprint of the construction sector. And so we're going to start to talk about the nexus, the relationship between the human right to housing and environmental justice. So just some of the questions that we'll be unpacking. But let me introduce you to our 4 speakers. So we have with us Marta Peña. Marta is the Shelter Senior Officer at the Department of Disasters, Climate and Crisis at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, IFRC, as you may know it as. Marta is originally an architect in training, joined the Federation or the IFRC in 2005, and has led and coordinated emergency response programs and reconstruction programs in Sri Lanka, Peru, Senegal, and other countries. Marta's based in Geneva and currently works as the focal point for surge support and capacity building. So has a strong understanding with and relationship of the realities of this work on the ground. We have Brett Moore. Brett is the chief of the Shelter and Settlement section of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. And in this role, Brett coordinates humanitarian shelter actors in both preparedness and response. Brett also co-leads the Global Shelter Cluster, which for those that aren't aware, it's a collective, you could say, of humanitarian agencies which undertake and coordinate emergency shelter response. And prior to Brett's engagement with UNHCR, Brett was the Shelter Infrastructure and Reconstruction Advisor with World Vision International, deployed to numerous crisis and post and reconstruction contexts globally. We have Alina Muzioł-Węcławowicz. Alina brings a doctorate and is an urban geographer, researcher and consultant specializing in housing, economy and policy. Alina brings a strong focus on social and affordable housing, looking at urban renewal and the links to local development. Alina currently cooperates, Alina currently cooperates with Habitat for Humanity Poland, the Institute of Urban and Regional Development and Local Governments, and is the author of quite a number of research papers. So if you Google Alina, I think you'll come up with some hits. And finally, we have Karimi Gitonga. Karimi is the Asia Regional Technical Advisor for DRR and Climate Change Adaptation. And Karimi works at Catholic Relief Services, currently based in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Karimi's worked with numerous INGOs across both Africa and Asia, with a focus on resilience program with internally displaced populations, refugees, and host community groups in numerous countries. And Karimi is currently maintaining this file focused on the Asia Pacific region, working with local partners, local governments, and homes and communities. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. I'm kind of looking forward soon to kind of hearing your thoughts and your reflections as we unpack the session. Before I do hand to you all, though, I just did want us to take some time to frame the session. And also highlight the relevance of this topic, especially on the days following COP26 and numerous other processes that are ongoing. So just please bear with me as I provide a framework for us to launch from. So we all anticipate, expect the increase in climate change and impacts of over the 21st century. What we know the jury is out on the degree of this change, right? And that significantly depends on the cooperation of the international community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon footprint. But in all of these scenarios, as I'm sure we all know, the consensus from the scientific community is extremely unsettling. Sea levels will rise, flooding will increase, heat waves will be more regular and increasingly intense. So that is a reality that we will face. And if we look at the hard data in our recent past, we see the impacts already. So over the past decade, climate and specifically weather-related disasters have impacted directly 1.7 billion people. Also in the last decade, 83% of disasters triggered by natural hazards are caused by extreme weather. So climate-related events, as we know, flooding, storms, heat waves. So that was in the last decade. If we look at the last year and linking to displacement, which we'll unpack shortly, in 2020, 30.7 million people were internally displaced by natural disasters. And of those that were internally displaced, 98%, so about 30 million, were displaced by climate-related weather hazards, the ones that we mentioned, a few seconds ago: storms, cyclones, floods. So what we're seeing is, and what we all know, we recognize, is when climate change affects everyone, but it has a disproportionate impact on the world's poorest, and it's often those that are contributing the least to climate change. And so if we narrow down more so on the topic of this session, if we focus on towns and cities, it is the most vulnerable in towns and cities that are often residing in the most at-risk or high-risk locations, informal settlements, low-lying coastal areas, floodplains, hillsides. And these populations are not only at risk geographically, but have the least resources and infrastructure available to reduce the risk and to adapt to the changing, to a changing climate, sorry. So that's one, and we see heat waves increasingly are another impact. An interesting number I was looking at last night is it's projected by 2050 that over 970 cities will experience average summertime temperatures of over 35 degrees. And I know if we look at many of the cities globally, they're not necessarily built for that incoming reality. So this is, without question, it's a whole of society problem, a whole of society approach requiring investment. And if we look at housing and shelter is one critical contributor to reduce vulnerability and to build resilience. So rather than me speaking anymore, what I would like to do is actually to start the discussion. And first, I'd like to turn to you, Marta, for some initial questions for yourself. So, Marta, you work with the Red Cross, the IFRC, so the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. It is the world's largest humanitarian organisation. You engage 17 million volunteers and nationals and the respective Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies or auxiliaries to local government. So you're uniquely placed to create impact both globally and locally. So two questions for you, and feel free to answer both in your initial thoughts. One, if you can share with us how the Red Cross, Red Crescent is approaching climate vulnerability broadly, but specifically related to housing and shelter and settlements. And building on that, what recommendations or measures do you propose which can be the most impactful to reduce vulnerability and strengthen preparedness? So Marta, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, James. And just before to start, I want to thank the opportunity to be able to be here and to share the work that we do. Then when we talk about vulnerability, the effort that we take today to address exposure as well as vulnerability and its root causes, including poverty, inequality, environmental degradation and mismanagement, social injustice, and failed governments, will determine how well people are able to cope today and tomorrow. The only way to reduce risk in the face of more climate-related hazard is to reduce the vulnerability and exposure of people. Okay? As the world continues to develop and evolve, our level of exposure and vulnerabilities are being shaped by the nature, as you were mentioned before, the nature of development planning and investment decisions. It's about land use and urban planning, infrastructure, measures to reduce poverty and inequality, and our management of the natural environment around us. Creating safer and more equitable cities, living conditions and environments, and supporting diversifying livelihoods can reduce the number of people at risk from weather and climate-related disasters. But mobilizing communities to act is a central component of all these efforts. When taking together such actions will protect lives and livelihood and reduce the need of emergency humanitarian aid in future, reducing the huge potential financial and human cost. But to do any of this well, we need to have the humanitarian, development, and climate environment sector to collaborate more than ever before. Climate change and urbanization are two of the most transformative trends for the last 20th and 21st centuries. As you mentioned before, it says more than half of the world population are already living in cities, but the projection is that 2/3 of them will be living in cities by 2050. Then climate change coupled with rapid and planned urbanization will exacerbate the scale and scope of disaster of impacts. Then the urban poor that you just mentioned, is just especially people living in slum and informal settlement. They face marginalization, insecure accommodation, limit access to life-sustaining services, higher proportional cost of living, risk of eviction, food insecurity, great health risk, whatever you name it. These communities are often living in the most exposed places as they cannot afford to live in safer locations. These informal settlements are usually on steep slopes, low-lying areas at the periphery of the city. As such, they are more exposed to either landslide and floods because of their location, the often weak structure of the housing, lack of insufficient drainage in the communities, and challenge in accessing basic services, among other socioeconomic conditions, place these communities at greater risk of any natural hazard. But not only this, is as the world continues to warm, the risk of extreme heat is also on the risk. Heat waves are more acute felt in cities, where construction materials retain heat, causing ambient temperatures to be significantly higher than any of the surrounding rural areas. Extreme heat is even more acute felt in slant and informed settlements that usually lack proper infrastructure and green areas or common and open space. Then climate change is a major threat, but it's how it interacts with vulnerability and exposure that produce disaster. Therefore, a critical part of our adaptation to climate-related disaster is not about the climate itself, but about the causes and circumstances that place people in risk and how we tackle this to avoid it happening. We as the Red Cross, we are not a development organization that usually build houses, especially outside of big emergency responses. Then the focus of our work is to reduce vulnerability and exposure of people in greater needs. Then we do not actively work on the provision of housing, as I mentioned, but we try to reduce the burden for people to be able to afford to live in safe accommodation, especially when we focus on work outside of emergency responses. Then it's through the integration of shelter actions into the programs, as for example, social protections, where we try to tackle this problem. It could be through the provision of temporary or long-term accommodation to homeless population. That is one of the main target groups that we used to work in our domestic program by our national societies. Then in their response to cold waves of pandemic, that it was the case in the European context for most countries during the COVID-19 outbreak, it was providing accommodation for people to be able to be out of the street. But we also think into the long term and how we can integrate this marginalized population into the society by facilitation the access of rental accommodation while we work together with other programs that try to minimize the vulnerabilities that they have. Okay. Then on the measures to reduce the vulnerability and strengthening the preparedness is something that we need to work at different levels. Okay. Then there is a need to start with to improve the availability and accessibility to climate-related data, to be able to incorporate in the program and to be able to tackle action related with it. We really need to make all development, disaster risk reduction, DRR, as you mentioned, and humanitarian program to make climate smart, to make climate consideration included when they define the programs. This climate smart programming need to be adapted into different time scales. It's about including long-term projections that can help us to identify important trends and shift on local climate that will inform the long-term risk reduction and adaptation needs, strategic future programming, policy dialogue, and investment priorities. But it's also about how we include midterm or seasonal forecasts that come from the monitoring of short-term forecasts carefully for potential extreme events or to invest in cross-sectoral preparedness for anomaly seasons. And it's about short-term forecasts that can trigger anticipatory actions. Anticipatory action that we need to scale up to prevent and mitigate the potential disaster impact before the shock or before acute impact are felt, based on prediction of how the event will fall. And even if it is a global need and it's a global problem, we should prioritize the scale up of development, climate change adaptation, and DRR in the areas and for the people who are most at risk. We need to listen and support local actors. We need to invest in nature-based solutions and more environmental sustainable approaches and collaborate across systems and levels. I know that all this is a little bit kind of too abstract, but We are also focused on specific actions. No? We are putting a lot of effort on understanding better what is to work in the urban context and how we can facilitate tools for the communities themselves to take action to mitigate, adapt, and reduce the risk to climate change in their day-to-day life. Then one of them is, for example, the Urban Action Toolkit that facilitates this easy action that can be taken directly by the community. Okay, but we also try to adapt other tools or approaches that we have about shelter DRR actions, and it will be the PASA, the participatory approach of safe shelter and settlement awareness that we have, and its version for youth, that really try to secure that this DRR standard tool are suited to fit into the urban context and considering climate risk when planning to adapt an improvement of living conditions. I also want to share a couple of examples of action that are doing by national societies that really tackle this kind of problems. Some of the things that I have been talking before more abstractly. And one is, for example, about strengthening environmental practice during COVID-19. That is also linked a little bit what it was yesterday discussing on the first day of the event. With the Spanish Red Cross has actively focused on strengthening environment sustainability during the last 15 years. And this includes integrating environmental aids in all the work that they do, including emergency responders. And when COVID-19 response came through, there was no different, and they integrated a specific objective to raise awareness of the environmental aspect of the pandemic. Okay. But COVID-19 also has an exacerbating effect on people already living in energy poverty. Then in Spain, it's about 4.5 million that could be at risk of this. And the Spanish Red Cross already since 2008, they were launched a 3-year program targeting 40,000 families to assist them in improving energy efficiency of their homes. That includes, for example, renovating works to improve the thermal performance to reduce the heat loss, but also providing guidance on how to improve environmental practice at home with recommendation of lighting, heat, air conditioner, water use, waste management, electricity consumption, of the use of appliances. Then this has become even more important as people have to stay at home, and they need to stay at home even during heat waves of extreme cold events. And therefore it was directly integrated into the COVID-19 response. Okay, as I mentioned before, is as the way that we try to tackle it is not always as having a silo focus of looking only on the shelter side, is how we integrate a specific action into a more cross intervention, okay, more integrated and holistic approaches. And there is another example that is really about managing risk across the time scale that I talked before, this long, medium, and short term, and it's in relation for heat waves. Heat waves, as you mentioned before, are deadly, predictable, and on the rise globally due to the climate change. It is therefore crucial to scale up effort around the globe to prevent heat waves' impact on the people. Their impact are also preventable through the deployment of sometimes simple, low-cost action in the short and medium term, and the implementation of long-term planning strategies. Then, for example, air conditioning is often the most common solution to deal with the excessive heat. So there is a long history of more passive measures. Anyway, but the use of air conditioning has quite negative effects. It could be the increase of energy consumption and pollution, will also increase the risk that confront people. But moreover, high upfront costs and infrastructure that are required put air conditioning out of risk for poor and vulnerable people. Then what are kind of the action that can be done for them to secure that they are still able to cope with this kind of situation? I also bring this example for the heat wave because heat wave is something of a special interest for us, where we have even defined an internal target that by 2025, from here in the next 5 years, we will intend that 250 million people will be better prepared for heat. That in a way is the most ignored and rapid rise in climate risk from our perspective. And then these 250 million that will be living in about 150 cities and towns is not more when you were already mentioning it, 970 are already confronting, but this kind of the first action that we try to contribute to secure this is kind of addressed. Then this example is outside of the region, but it's something that directly relates with the European context. What I'm going to talk is some action that it was taking place in India to tackle this problem. Then it was in Gujarat. Then as the long-term action to reduce the heat stress, the government implemented district cooling. And this district cooling is done through a centralized air conditioning system that chilled water and is distributed to consumer through underground pipes, okay? Then this is kind of the long-term intervention that they were planning. In the medium to term, for this critical measure to take place, they were also identifying what it was the most vulnerable population, the one who were kind of confronted to the higher level of death when this heat wave was happening. And through the assessment that they were doing, they came clearly that women and elderly are often those who are more exposed to the heat, because usually they tend to stay at home. And in the case of Gujarat, because of the security on the neighborhood, for example, they were kind of keeping the windows closed to be scary and try to avoid the petit crime. Then being able to focus action to target this more vulnerable group is also enabled to take and to improve the condition that they were facing. Nevertheless, while recognizing that not all risks related to extreme heat can be reduced, as a short-term action, the Indian Red Cross implemented awareness-raising campaign based on weather forecasts of heat waves. And then this action was just moving from flash mob dance by volunteers in public crowded market spaces or at the airport to prepare for heat waves of temperatures about 43. Then it's also this kind of, it's not an action that we can trigger by ourselves, it's an action that we need to confront at multi-layer. Then for the time being, I think this is enough. Thanks.
Thanks, Marta. That was really interesting. And just two things I wanted to call out for everyone on the call. The IF, so Marta referenced the two Ifrc toolkits. One was the Urban Action Toolkit, and the second was PASA, Participatory Approach to Safe Shelter Awareness. I just wanted to encourage you highly to go and check them out. They're extremely practical, well-tested tools to both look at, obviously, housing, shelter and settlements, and looking at household level climate resilience. So just a shout out to that. And yeah, thank you, Marta, for this. So the practical examples, and I think the first one you were speaking about with the work of the Red Cross, and you were highlighting the example of, yes, integrated programming is the approach that is needed to address crises that aren't singular, right? COVID-19 and climate, and a changing climate. And I think moving forward, I think it's going to be hard to identify what the one cause for a crisis was. These will continue to conflate. So just wanted to thank you for that intervention, Marta. Brett, can I turn to you now, please? So just some initial thoughts. So knowing climate change and what we're already seeing will continuously drive up rates of displacement, international or within country. So we're seeing large population flows, which are also impacting host communities, and especially in towns and cities, this is overstretching. This is stretching already often overburdened services, public services. And what we've seen as well is can relate in social tension and conflict, and again, escalating a crisis. So with this backdrop, two questions for you. First, knowing UNHCR's mandate to support displaced populations, can you speak to how the UNHCR is addressing the issue of or anticipating increased climate migration in coming years? Where are your pivots? Where are you changing? What are you doing more of the same? So that would be one. And two is looking more so from a shelter and settlements perspective. I mean, what are the strategies? Where and how can we provide more support to host governments, whether they're national or local, to provide support to both displaced and host communities? Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, James. Well, you've given me some easy questions there to answer. It'll only take me a second. No, these are extremely complicated questions, and the issues are grounded in, the reality of trying to move a system that's been established to respond to a certain set of conditions in a different direction. In the introductory comments, when you were framing the session, you touched on a lot of the key data. I might just add a few more pieces as well. And Marta has already also explained a lot of the kind of key contextual issues that we're trying to deal with. So I'll look at the same kind of overall parameters, but really from the specifics of the organisation, and then a little bit around what the cluster itself is doing. So as you mentioned in your introduction, my job is looking at the operational aspect of UNHCR still to a large degree, and then also the interagency coordination processes which are required to make mileage along a lot of these issues. Really, in terms of where we're at, I think that this is true for all organisations, and it's true for the entire humanitarian system. We're in largely uncharted territory. Not that we don't know what needs to be done or can be done, but we're trying to also make sure that we comprehend the opportunities, but also limits of our organisational response within what we're doing, within the limited funds that are available, and also making sure that we work with the expertise and talents, skills of other agencies. I mean other humanitarian agencies, but also development agencies, and certainly working with governments and with affected populations, but in a much different way than what we had been in the past, I think, where we were relying purely on an emergency response posture. Just to kind of look at some of the figures, I know you mentioned some, but I think the even more recent ones are slightly more confronting, and that really is that there's around 82 million forcibly displaced people. So we make a big distinction internally between forcibly displaced and non-forcibly displaced. When someone's forcibly displaced within their own country, they're referred to as IDPs, internally displaced people. And when they cross the international border and seek asylum, we account for them as refugees. So we break down the population data according to these different kinds of status. And our statistical reports are available on the UNHCR website that explains the movement, the refugee and IDP generating countries and the refugee and IDP hosting countries. It breaks this down geographically and also in terms of absolute numbers and disaggregated numbers as well. So there's some very rich data, which I think everyone online would really enjoy, because it places this issue very precisely geographically. For example, 75% of all displaced refugees reside in the neighbouring countries from their source of displacement, and around more than 80% of all refugees originate from 5 countries. So there's some real details here where we can look into the origin of the displacement, the country of hosting, and then some, actions that might be possible. The figures at the moment underneath that 82 million really are, though, that there's around 26 million refugees and around 48 million IDPs. Now, these cover more than 130 countries in total, although the numbers in some countries are still quite small. It's worthwhile noting that these figures don't really include all kinds of climate displacement. It isn't something that we've been able to completely capture. There are a lot of trends, but I think it's important to note that of these overall displacement figures, when we understand people's reasons for displacement, they are multiple and they're varied. We understand this because we do a lot of surveys and sampling. We call them intention surveys. Why have people left their homes? What are the reasons? What are their impediments to returning home, etc., etc. Rarely do people immediately identify climate. They mostly identify conflict. But when we unpick that more, the root of a lot of conflict is actually in climate and climate-related displacement. So suffice to say that when people move, they move for multiple reasons. And and it takes some time to unpick these issues, see where they're connected and what the primary drivers of forced displacement are. So against this backdrop of the complex nature and interrelationship of disaster, climate change as fuels and triggers, but also consequences of conflict, this can maybe be located down into a few key things. Certainly as the climate is changing, over competition for resources, the economic impact of that, and then further the political destabilization that is taking place because of that. Now, this manifests inside countries, sometimes at very local levels, but certainly sometimes across multiple countries and at regional levels. And when we think of examples, say, the Sahel, sub-Saharan Africa, this part of West Africa, where there's a complicated series of triggers, but also events and impacts that are coming from climate, from political destabilization and the rise of armed groups. It's also coming about due to the loss of productive assets, livelihoods. These are all fueling movement within countries. It's fueling movement from urban to rural areas, and the predominant nature of that displacement is actually certainly in large cities, but the largest urban growth is taking place in medium-sized cities. So the estimate overall really is that of all refugees, of that 26 million, around 90% come from countries that are also experiencing complicated cyclical and protracted climate emergencies. Of all the people that are internally displaced, as I mentioned, roughly the 48 million, around 70% of those relate the root of their displacement to the impact of climate. So there's an element, varying degrees, but an element of climate-induced displacement. Now, I've spent a little bit of time kind of unpacking this data because it is important and we need to slice it and look at it in different ways to understand the root cause and therefore maybe what some of the immediate actions might be. As I mentioned, the Sahel is a place where this is all manifesting at once, and we see it also maybe largely in the Great Lakes area of the central parts of Africa. We see it throughout the Middle East. A lot of commentators have looked at the roots of the Syria crisis as having climate impact as well, or being driven by climate, where there was a large rural-urban migration 10 years before the beginning of the conflict there. And there's a lot of trigger points that did come from these protracted droughts where people's livelihoods were heavily impacted and chronic and long-term displacement eventuated. One other aspect around this, which I think is important to highlight for everyone, is that UNHCR responds in all contexts, urban, rural, IDP, refugee. From the technically specific element of this, which you raised, James, we spend around 700 to 800 million a year on shelter and settlement-related responses across around 46 countries at the moment. But of course, the shelter and settlement aspect is not all that we look at. There's a lot of other aspects as well around health and protection, etc., which I won't cover at the moment. But there's a lot of explanation and information available there online. Traditionally, much of this response was emergency in nature. And without sounding critical, I think it's fair enough to say that a lot of this was in response to a displacement. One different feature that we see now is that we need to be much more proactive, and we need to be much more effective at working with governments and affected communities well before the most significant displacement actions take place. That, of course, links to a lot of the issues that Marta raised, but also how we look at the trends and the analysis around current displacement and future projections to see where we best put our efforts. There's a limited amount of resources available, funding, so we need to look far beyond existing partnerships. and find different ways of working with government than we have in the past. Traditionally, an agency like UNHCR would have a very close relationship with the line ministries that work with refugees and IDPs. But when we're looking at climate-related issues, whether they're long-term change or more short-term protracted issues around flooding and heat or something else, there's a range of different actors, different departments, different municipalities that we need to really work with in a different kind of way. So fundamentally, I'm saying we need to move past a humanitarian response posture, be in there early, work with different actors, and ultimately work really much more effectively with people at a local scale. So this requires a rethink of our traditional responses and also our sectoral structure. We can no longer really say this is a shelter issue, this is a health issue, this is a wash issue, or those previously humanitarian defined silos. We need to step outside that to a degree. We need to expand the coverage of issues of what we were looking at, but also work much more laterally across these existing structures, because the issues are inherently multi-sectoral, and it only really is through that way of working that we'll find the answers and the kind of programmatic opportunities that we need to move forward. So this will be multi-sectoral. It'll certainly manifest in different ways over different time periods and in different geographic scales. For example, Marta pointed it out also that there'll be a lot of local change, local flooding and heat at a very, very local level, but then there'll be national, regional and multi-country kinds of issues. Some of them will be unfolding over a longer time period, and some of them are already very, very evident in areas where there's severe flooding 4 times a year. South Sudan at the moment, severe flooding that takes months and months and months to reduce in intensity, leaving 700,000, 800,000 people inundated. And this is the first time they've really faced these kinds of issues that are recurring again and again and again. Sometimes when we're looking at the impact of climate change, we focus a lot on Southeast Asia, and that is true. The frequency and the severity of issues there is vastly increasing, but the heat and the cyclical rains that have now gone, years and years well below regular levels in West Africa, in East Africa, means that even since the early 1970s, when you look at, say, the root of the conflict in Somalia and the unwinding of the Siad Barre regime there, a lot of that has its roots in tens of thousands of nomadic agro-pastoralists who lost their livelihood opportunities and were never able to regain them, took up arms and then formed an insurgency under Al-Shabaab, which still exists today. So this has been going for 30 to 40 years. So we're now sometimes re-examining the effects of what has been an intensifying climate crisis, but we're looking at it through a different lens. I think this is really important because it'll give us a different perspective to understand it and then maybe hopefully find different paths of action and solutions from this. And I also think that as the collective, as humanitarian agencies, from the perspective of the Global Shelter Cluster, we're really looking hard at our traditional shelter approaches, sharing some learning and impact and, getting good donor support to change the way that we do things, have a much stronger environmental lens, work much more locally through local solutions. Because really, in the end, it is about finding the traditional approaches that can be scaled, that can work well. It's around finding, ways that communities can use their traditions, build resilience, find new economic and social opportunities to breed and, invest in bottom-up responses to change. And I think that will really work to recraft and recast the way that humanitarian agencies respond through this series of new ways of thinking through the crisis, taking the best of what we currently do and then working to adapt what we're doing and look at these new issues, new contexts, new approaches through a much more kind of local way of viewing things. There's a few more issues that I'll add in, but I'll leave it for the time being, and I might come back to them later. But thanks, James and colleagues.
Thanks, Brett. That's great. I'm kind of wanting you to unpack further, but I'm also conscious we're still to hear from Alina and Karimi. I just, if you allow me, I just wanted to call out, I found what you mentioned earlier, but rarely do people, and this makes sense, this is a very understandable, identify climate as the primary rationale for displacement, right? It's as you said, often it's related, most common, it's related to conflict, and it's clearly apparent. But when you unpack the root causes, there's a climate driver, right, which could be historical. So I find that extremely interesting. And as you said, understanding this holistically allows us to take a new approach of how this issue can be addressed. So just wanted to call that out. And if we have time, you also mentioned the need to move beyond sort of, yes, the traditional humanitarian development kind of ways of working and to work with donors, partners differently. And I'll be curious if we have the time to just for you to unpack a little bit more about what that could look like, what these kind of different ways of working are. But let's pause for now. And if I can, Alina, if I can turn to you, and I know you're involved with the upcoming World Urban Forum in Katowice next year, and I'm curious, what you're seeing, how the WOOF is sort of shaping up, to speak to further address or further identify, commitments and actions related to the impact of climate change and housing. So I'm curious if you're seeing what you're seeing there. So that would be one, and then two, perhaps more practically from your experience. So from housing projects or urban renewal programs that I know you're involved in across Poland, like what good practice, what experiences you would like to share about how these programs can strengthen adaptation to climate change? So thank you, Alina, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really very glad that I have the possibility to share some information concerning especially the World Urban Forum, the 11th event, which will take place in our city of Katowice. But let me please start with some general statement that nowadays it's really extremely hard to take action in reducing climate vulnerability of the people, of the urban poor people. The incentives which we may use are quite similar to those who are offered to all the social groups in a urgent need to reduce energy consumption, for example. The problem is that for the poor, if we are working for the poor people, it is much more difficult to find and implement long-lasting, reasonable incentives. And there are many limitations. For example, let me mention that we experience a rapid increase of the energy costs, especially of heating, as far as the moderate and cold zones are concerned. I mean, inhabitants of that areas. Then the initial cost of the implementation of the pro-climate instruments in housing, and they concern both the thermomodernization of the existing stock and the replacement of heating system, old-fashioned heating and systems into more ecological one, are very high. So it is really hard to take the action by poor people. Then there are in many countries there are quite weak systems of the housing allowances, which even if in a particular incentives for energy cost of the energy are included or are offered to the citizens, They are usually very low in terms of value of money or share of the energy costs covered by that subsidy, and they usually address the historical prices of the energy, and the procedures are very bureaucratic, and for less experienced people, it's really hard task to fulfill all the needed documents, applications, etc., and we are not able to solve this, I would say, quite technical issue to allow to increase the accessibility of the, for example, energy allowances to the people, to the poor people. We should also remind that there are also the owner-occupied sector. I mean, people living in their own single-family houses. They have to take action to improve their heating systems, for example, and they are quite often also very fragile as far as the financial capacities are concerned, because many of them are not able to finance the needed investments without reasonable support, and especially in the countryside and in small cities. So we have, on the other hand, this inhabitants are responsible for the huge production of the pollution and greenhouse gases, etc. So it's hard to implement the incentives which may limit the bad impact of the single houses systems of heating, especially. And of course, the urban poor people really need special treatment, and we have to support them to a great extent. As far as the World Urban Forum is concerned, in June 2022, in the Polish city Katowice, will host the World Urban Forum, and the title of this meeting is transforming our cities for a better urban future. And this is important conference. It is organized, as you may all probably know, by the UN Habitat for Urban and Growth and Human Settlements, and it concerns municipal policies, transformation, and development. And the main idea, as usual in the case of such conferences, is to exchange the experiences, to share the good practices in sustainable development of urban areas, and of course there will be quite open debates on this subject. A meeting will result hopefully with recommendation or renewed recommendation for urban policy and regional development, which will be addressed for governments, regions, and cities itself. And the event is taking place every 2 years, and this will be 11th meeting of that. And we expect quite a huge number of participants as well. So there will be, again, we'll host the representatives of the government, of the regions, of the cities, and also non-governmental organizations, including international, of course, and also financial institutions will be present at this conference. Katowice is the city which is the capital of the Upper Silesia region in Poland, and you probably know the Silesia is commonly recognized as the region of the coal mining, heavy industry, and the huge air pollution, probably the highest, the strongest pollution in the whole Europe. But the city, of course, there is a transformation, although as compared with other countries, quite small and postponed towards the next years. In my opinion, it's a bit dangerous, but the city of Katowice itself, as capital of the region and also the capital of the formal metropolitan region, is quite successful in transforming its economy, its local economy, and the city becomes the leader of the innovation and new technologies. So don't be afraid of visiting this city. And also there are 17, as you know, there are 17 sustainable development goals, and during the conference, the progress in obtaining these goals will be referred and will be presented. And the best practices in preparation and implementations of the country's urban policies will be discussed as well. And we hope that housing and also the role of housing in limiting the climate changes will be discussed and be quite openly, and hopefully will not tackle only will not tackle the policy statement, but we should talk about the real actions to build the stock of affordable housing, healthy, energy efficient housing for all the people, including those who are poor. And housing is traditionally allocated to the goal number 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. And we hope that during the Katowice meeting, there will be a chance to increase the role or strengthen the position of housing issues in processes to obtain a majority of other goals. For example, goal number 1, no poverty, goal dealing with affordable and clean energy, and responsible consumption and production. So this is the idea that housing will get a much stronger position in action, which will be shared by the participants of the conference. And the problem is with climate change is quite huge, because when talking about the future migrants, we have underlined that many cities in Europe, majority according to my opinion, are not satisfied with fulfilling their duties towards own low income citizens, and this will be really a huge challenge to settle internal and international migrants as well, because probably the social housing is the sector which will host these people. And so in what we are doing now in Poland for this conference, there are 3 types of action First, the city of Katowice is promoting its pro-environmental activities in all the spheres of the public life. I'm not going to report. They will present their programs during the conference. There is the national urban policy, and the governmental document is now being updated to include more challenges, among others, those which deal with the climate changes and housing, hopefully. And there is a project for the cities. It is called the Action Plan for the Cities. This is an invitation for cities to prepare their own projects, which are aimed at obtaining at least one of the 17 goals of the UN Sustainable Development. And the cities will be supported somehow in technical advisory and to prepare their projects, to implement them, and then to present during the conference. Since we have probably not much time, I just would like to, because it's obvious that urban renewal programs are the very good occasion for exercising the pro-climate housing intervention, and this is and due to the fact that the neighborhoods in crisis in the cities are the concentration of the social, technical, environmental, spatial problems. The idea which we would like to promote is to treat this program, urban renewal programs, as a field of obtaining experiences, which then can provide the good solutions to implement the program for the whole cities. So, due to the fact that there are some special incentives that the areas are carried out in a procedure of social participation, so it's easier to for good cooperation between inhabitants and the providers and the other stakeholders, that projects are concentrated on selected areas, so the risk of the fail is also smaller than in case of all the programs which are supposed to be implemented in all the cities. Then they are also implemented together with other types of action, especially social actions to the inhabitants. So the probability of the success seems to be quite high, and that's why I'd like to stress that, underline that housing projects in urban renewal programs are the good case to experience and to manage the new approaches towards the climate changes of pro-climate investment in housing. Thanks.
Thanks, Alina. No, I remember you noted earlier at the beginning how extremely hard it is to take action with the urban poor related to housing and energy efficiency and household resilience, or household climate resilience. You mentioned that really the solutions that are available the solutions that are available to the poor are the same solutions that are available to those with more resources and higher kind of economic groups. So to me, it just highlighted certainly one, a resourcing issue, but two, a challenge to find lower cost appropriate solutions, right, that are accessible to more poor and vulnerable populations. So thank you for that. I'm conscious of time. Karimi, let's turn to you, and in your role, I know with CRS and with whether it's NGOs, civil society more broadly, by nature, your agencies have a proximity to vulnerable populations, right? You play a significant role in reducing vulnerability with the population itself, whether that's in response, whether that's in preparedness or recovery. So if I can ask you to speak to two things. One, from your experience with CRS and other NGOs, what do you see as the key added value of NGOs and civil society? Could you speak to that for one? And two, a practical question, right? So, we've discussed throughout the session that, we cannot silo this issue, right? And in your role as a technical advisor for CRS, from a practical perspective, how do you approach or how do you situate housing and shelter in relation to other sectors, right? Within the intent to reduce household vulnerability. Thanks, Karimi.
Great. Thanks, James. And thanks for the questions. I'm glad you didn't save the easy questions till last. But it's also a pleasure to be able to be here and speak for CRS and talk about some of our experiences. In terms of the first question and the added value of NGOs and civil society in reducing vulnerability, I think there's a number of areas we could mention. The most obvious is our role, which is very much linked to localization in terms of community mobilization, coordination, and education. I mean, a large focus of many NGOs and civil society organizations is supporting communities actually on the ground to build their own adaptive capacities and put interventions which look to tackle climate change through mitigation or adaptation into practice. Ideally, as organizations, we reflect the diversity in the communities that we work with, but at the least, we're allowing communities to contribute their own knowledge and their lived experiences into any sort of vulnerability reduction and really like their understanding of risks, which I think has been mentioned by some of the previous participants as well. Alongside working with communities directly, we also do work with local government and other key stakeholders, such as the private sector, on similar aspects of capacity building. And an example is we're working with secondary cities in one country and working with municipal governments on building their capacity to access, utilize, and communicate climate change information and data and translate those into fundable and bankable climate change investments, which will lead to urban nature-based solutions being put onto the ground. Maybe another role that we do play, and it's sort of mentioned in this, is as a convener or facilitator, essentially bringing together multiple stakeholders and acting as a glue between them. And we're talking about diverse stakeholders, meteorologists, climate scientists, researchers, academics, private sector, local organizations, local government, and also affected communities themselves. And I think here, we're really putting into practice like the principles of like locally led adaptation in this, but our role is also to make sure that everybody at the table can understand each other, break down sort of communication and language barriers, and make sure we can like support effective collaboration. So I think those are maybe some of the like common roles in terms of mobilization, education, convening, facilitating. I would say maybe the most important is maybe on accountability. And it's one where admittedly we have the most work to do. As we give communities participation opportunities and give them a seat at the table, it's how we use these spaces to allow communities themselves to express their own views and exercise their own voice. It's how we hold ourselves and government to account, both in terms of and other duty bearers, both in terms of the root causes of climate change itself, but also in terms of the programs that we develop and the way we work with local actors to be able to reduce vulnerability and support them. I think a lot of the talk that came out of COP26 was really focused on credibility gaps, but I think there's still an accountability gap that's missing and is as wide, if not wider. And it's something that we do need to do better. So I guess those would be the thoughts for the first question. For the second question, in terms of how we as CRS kind of view shelter in comparison to other sectors and in comparison to shelter and housing in comparison to climate change, I think our approach has changed and evolved a lot over time, but we really do see homes and community as the foundation of family life at CRS. And a lot of our work does focus with working with people who've been in crisis as a result of conflict or human or natural disasters, and for whatever reason they're either seeking new homes or they're sort of displaced from their housing. And I think it was picked up by Brett as well that we do increasingly see sort of migration and as a push factor very much linked to disasters and climatic events in the region. I think the term climate migrants is starting to be used more commonly in Asia. It's still a bit of a gray area and not very well defined, but I think it's clear that climate change and the impacts of climate change alongside climatic events are a push factor in the decision making for people who are migrating, and we're seeing that more and more in Asia. And I think the IPCC report, the outcomes at COP26, but also the urgency and desperation that was shown at the event as well, really do speak to that. But in terms of how it affects our approach, we recognize that people in crisis or recovering from crisis have needs related to shelter, but also economic impacts, vulnerability, health, water, protection, hygiene, mental health, all sorts of other factors. And alongside this, they have long-term aspirations and development goals. And we really do think that throughout this, they remain the agents and drivers of their own destinies. And we really do work to keep them in that position. And so our approach really focuses on access to safe and dignified homes and communities. And this means trying to take a more of a systems level view and looking at systems level intervention. I think we mentioned a sort of holistic approach and integrating through multiple sectors and really ensuring the ownership and leadership of communities in the process. This means that we could be considering economic resilience and skills building, disaster risk reduction, climate change, social cohesion and community strengthening in our approaches, as well as looking at issues of access to housing and settlement planning as well. I think a good example of this is probably a program we recently had in the Philippines, which was our Anibong resettlement program. It was based in Tacloban, and it was working with 883 households or families who were displaced as a result of Typhoon Haiyan, and they were essentially needing to relocate from no-build zones and try and restore their lives and livelihoods in a sort of safe and dignified and sustainable manner. And so we worked with them to develop and build a new community, looking to provide permanent homes, looking at essential infrastructure and services, and also looking at issues in terms of land titling as well. I think a real plus is that families were engaged throughout the process in terms of selection of beneficiaries, in terms of site selection, in terms of settlement planning, in terms of housing design, and also in terms of determining their own sort of self-governance arrangements for this community moving forwards. Throughout the project, as I said, we worked together and developed 883 permanent homes for around 4,000 affected community members, and this included water and sanitation systems, included drainage, included community facilities, working with the Ministry of Education to provide a site for schools, working on sort of infrastructure and the road network as well. And community were very much leading this. Housing designs were very much done in a participatory manner, with communities choosing which sort of housing options would suit them best based on their sort of needs and requirements. And we also had teams working on ensuring earthquake resistance and storm resistant in terms of housing design linked to national standards. We were looking at building livelihoods through community savings and silk, social savings and internal loan groups, building capacity of homeowners associations and to self-govern this sort of area, and looking at areas of DRR behavior change as well. I think this also was very much focused on building the local economy, and so we worked with mobilizing local actors, local skilled and unskilled labor to support this. I think 1,600 local employment opportunities were provided, but it's very much how we want to be working in CRS in terms of a model of how we can work with disaster-affected communities, especially in urban areas, and use that as a way to describe how to bring about sort of safe, sustainable, and sort of resident-governed solutions for these groups. And I think it's an example that we take as an organization, and we use it maybe in different ways when we look at localization and sort of human settlements approaches and that sort of integrated and holistic way of thinking. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there, and it's just an idea of I think how we work as organizations, but it's very much in line with what everyone said already.
Thanks, Karimi. Certainly noted. You mentioned at the beginning that sort of the role of a convener and a facilitator of civil society is so critical. And we won't have time for this as well, but you mentioned when you were referencing the Anabong resettlement program in the Philippines, you touched on HLP and land and titling. And I mean, you know, when we look at climate-induced displacement, that is such a significant issue, whether it's at an individual or family level titling up to much broader swathes of land and comes into loss and damage and political issues. I would love to unpack this, but we unfortunately won't have time. I am conscious of time. We have around 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do now is actually, Brendan, Marta, to ask you this question first, and then let's see how we go with time, because I want to leave some time for closing remarks. I'd like us to talk about the intersection between affordable housing and environmental justice. So, you know, we're well aware of the growing housing deficit, rapid rise of informal settlements, the rising cost of formal homes, and other barriers that exist on this side. Here, if we look at on this side, the global construction sector accounts for 38% of global emissions. Right, housing, yes, is a component of that, aside from commercial and industrial, but it is there and it is real. With an interesting note of buildings equivalent to the size of Paris being built every week. So, kind of acknowledging this, I'd Brett first, and then Ella, Marta, if you'd like to add. If you could speak to how do we navigate this, right? The need for increased access to housing and shelter with the reality of the carbon contribution or carbon footprint that is associated with current ways of working. I'd love to hear reflections or strategies that we could put in place. Brett.
Thanks, James. Thanks a lot. That's a rather shocking statistic that you just mentioned there about the number of buildings being constructed. I mean, I'll keep my response as short as a minute or so. And I know we don't have much time left, and I certainly don't have the answer. But I know that, I think that really colleagues within Habitat for Humanity look a lot at affordability of housing. It's not an issue that I'm an expert in, but what I can say is that when we look at the deficit that you've mentioned, we've got, say, 1 billion people that are living in slums around the world. We've got 80 million forcibly displaced, and the predictions for further displacement related to climate change are enormous, in the hundreds of millions. So when we chart our trajectory of what's happening, where we should be versus where we currently are, the gap is just widening and widening and widening. So by any kind of measure, whichever way we cut the numbers, we're not on the right path. That's clear. One thing from my side, I think, is that, clearly there was a much bigger investment and buy-in of the government sector into housing in the past. I mean, look at the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. Governments, regional development banks, bilateral, multilateral support were heavily in favour of promoting social housing. The scene has changed completely now, where we have the provision of housing moving from an essential requirement to a commodified process of investment in the built environment, largely with, further exacerbated through speculative land and property development. Now, with that has come the source of a lot of wealth and prosperity for a lot of people, tax revenues for government, stamp duties and so forth. But there's a widening gap, and we see this across all contexts, wealthy and poor countries alike, of rising income disparity and inability to access this. On the humanitarian side, we work toward an inverse economic logic where there's a grant and you spend to zero within the time you're allowed in order to produce a shelter outcome. The private sector works the opposite. You charge as much as you possibly can for your housing interventions so you can create the profit margin that you and your investors would require and minimise your expenditure. So we've got an inverse logic between both of these economic models. Both of them don't work that well. The private sector-led model around those that can afford quality housing will get it, and the rest of you just have to make do. That isn't working, as we've discussed. And the other option, largely unchanged for decades by the humanitarians, is the context of grant and donor-driven approaches, which we know that the grant amounts, the financial component for humanitarian responses is not increasing comparative to the increasing needs. So we've got some pretty dire situations there to work with. One thing, I think it comes back to a lot of the issues that Karimi outlined, where a lot of communities, when we encourage locally led approaches that are suitable from a kind of cultural resilience and capacity position, they are inherently more affordable because they're using local materials. So I think that we have to work with that. There'll be multiple streams, and then we'll find some answers that meet the expectations and needs of all these different kinds of user groups. I'll leave it at that, but thanks, James. Thanks,
Brett. Marta.
Okay, I just want to add a couple of things very quickly. It's as I fully believe of what Brett was saying, is no doubt that the need is there and we cannot ignore it. I think what we also need to take is more ownership of our own responsibility and how we work as a sector to ourselves reduce our footprint. So far, the decision that we have been working now has been much more focused on the economic and the social side, but we have neglected quite a lot what is the environmental pillar for the sustainability. Then I think that while we continue working on supporting communities to meet their need, we also need to make a strong effort to reduce ourselves the greenhouse gas emission in the operation that we run also. Then it's kind of a shared responsibility. We also cannot see us, we are not part of the problem. All of us are part of the problem and all of us has to be part of the solution. That's it very quickly.
Thanks so much, Marta. Karimi or Alina, any short reflections that you'd like to add from what you've heard from Brett or Marta? No problem.
I do support the speakers, and thanks.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the need to work differently. I think, if anything, COVID has shown us that we are capable of change and doing things differently as a society en masse if we have the will and the commitment. And I feel we just need to really put that into practice as well. The solutions exist and the models exist, but it's that commitment and will.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Karimi. So a few more minutes. What I'd like to do, and Karimi, maybe you've just done this, but I'll give you another opportunity. What I'd like is a 30-second soundbite from each of you. What is one key message that you would like our audience to leave with from your perspective? So I'm going to see who looks ready. Alina, can I start with you? Any 30-second
Yes.
30-second takeaway?
Yes. 30 seconds. I think that we have to leave the quite conservative action which towards the protection of our climate, and we should take much more intensive action. Good news is that, as far as I know, the legal regulations in the countries concerning the new housing construction as well as modernization of the stock are quite, how to say, strict as far as the energy efficiency and anti-pollution conditions are concerned. But what we need, and we need this, is the massive and urgent intervention in the existing stock, especially though this stock which is called commonly social stock and which is in majority inhabited by the poor people. They really need this sector, the subsector of the housing needs strong and intervention, and strong and urgent intervention. Thanks.
Thanks, Alina. Marta.
Okay, I think the cost of doing nothing, it will be too high for us. Then it's something that we will not be able to afford. There is a need to invest on solving the root problems instead of continue fighting what are the symptoms. And I will say it's a collaborative effort. It's not something that we will be able to do in isolation. We really need to work as one team trying to achieve it.
Thank you, Marta. Karimi.
I would say that at the heart of, I think, both the issues of the environment and some of housing are sort of rights-based issues. And if we think about that from that perspective and think about working with some of these duty bearers, how we strengthen governments to lead in this area if some of the other models haven't worked previously, and use that as a route to work differently. But yeah, collaboration in doing that is really important.
Collaboration. Thanks, Karimi. Brett.
Thanks, James. I mean, not dissimilar from the other colleagues, the panelists. Don't forget about the poor. The most vulnerable will be the ones that are disproportionately affected. And if their needs are not attended to with equity, that'll be detriment for a whole of society approach. So we need the needs of all attended to, not just the needs of the few. The reality is that if these aren't properly addressed, that'll be the root cause of further social and political destabilization that no one and no country can really afford. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. I think you said it more than all of you, all than I could. So I will. I'm going to close it there, and thank you all for the for the time. I think you've articulated in your closing remarks the session very well. I will not add to that. So I want to thank you for the time. There are some areas I wish we could have had some more time to unpack, but we are on a time frame. So Brett, Marta, Karimi, Alina, thank you very much for your time. For those that joined, likewise. And Dean, back to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you to our panelists, Brett, Alina, Karimi and Marta, for a great discussion. I think it brilliantly mapped the varied and challenging landscape of climate change, how it impacts the most vulnerable, the rapidly growing urban poor, who will bear the brunt of increased flooding, heat waves and competition for increasingly scarce and expensive resources. We heard how difficult it is for these populations to adapt and switch from fossil fuel energy to climate-friendly systems. How can we help them make that change and reduce their carbon gas emissions? How can we provide sustainable, low-cost alternatives? We heard about the limitations of traditional emergency responses to displacement and forced migration and the need for earlier analysis and intervention. While few refugees and displaced people cite climate change as the main cause of their flight, climate change, its impact on landscape, livelihoods and resource-focused disputes are often contributory factors. We heard about the conflict in Somalia, where the insurgency is commonly seen through the prism of jihadism, but in fact has roots in the loss of livelihoods by its nomadic groups. We explored the need for a more holistic response to displacement emergencies, focused on local needs and resources, and the benefit of a convener-focused approach. COVID has shown us that we have far more capacity for change and adaptation than we believed, and that we can take different approaches where there is a will and commitment. So thank you all for your contributions. We're now going to move into our breakout sessions. 4 parallel discussions for you to choose from. Is housing the solution to homelessness in Eastern and Central Europe? Housing innovation to radically improve the lives of low-income families? Applying market systems development approaches to housing, the journey so far, and economic recovery and growth through housing in Eastern and Central Europe. At the end of those breakouts, we're going to take a 13-minute break for coffee and networking, and we'll meet back here for the next roundtable discussion on the role of public-private partnerships in promoting affordable social housing. So that's at 15:30. I'll see you back here then.